Atlanta in the late 1970s called itself the city too busy to hate. But beneath the hopeful slogan, the city's Black community was struggling. Poverty rates were high, segregation lingered in neighborhoods and schools, and distrust between Black residents and law enforcement ran deep. This city was trying to move forward, but not everyone was moving at the same pace. In the summer of 1979, Atlanta's reputation as a place to grow and progress began to unravel. Black children and teens began to disappear. At first, the cases seemed isolated, a runaway here, a boy who didn't come home there, but by the end of the year, the city faced a truth it could no longer deny. Someone was targeting Atlanta's children. The first two victims were discovered together. 14-year-old Edward Hope Teddy Smith disappeared July 21, 1979. He was last seen leaving his home in the afternoon, but he never returned. 4 days later, 13-year-old Alfred Q. Evans vanished while walking to a friend's house. Weeks later, both boys were found in a wooded area off Niskey Lake Road. Edward had been shot with a .22 caliber gun. Alfred's death was ruled strangulation. The brutality and the fact that the boys were left together signaled something Atlanta had never seen before. These were not runaways. This was the beginning of a killing spree. On September 4th, 1979, 14-year-old Milton Harvey set out on his bicycle to run an errand for his mother, depositing a payment at Citizens Trust Bank. He never made it home. His bicycle was found abandoned in a wooden lot near Red Wine Road. His body wasn't discovered until November, by which point decomposition made it impossible to determine an exact cause of death. Milton was remembered as a respectful boy, a steady presence in his home. His mother insisted he wasn't the type to run away. His disappearance deepened the fear growing across the city. For Atlanta's Black families, a terrifying question was forming: who would be next? Then, in October, the case would forever haunt Atlanta. 9-year-old Yusuf Bell. On October 21st, he ran to a corner store to buy snuff for a neighbor, something he had done before. Witnesses later recalled seeing him near McDaniel and Fulton Streets, possibly getting into a blue car. 18 days later, on November 8th, Yusuf's body was found in the crawl space of an abandoned elementary school. He had been bludgeoned on the head and strangled. For his mother, Camille Bell, Yusuf's death was a breaking point. She became one of the loudest voices demanding answers, eventually founding the Committee to Stop Children's Murders, which organized marches, vigils, and media campaigns. Camille Bell's courage turned grief into activism and forced Atlanta to pay attention. By the end of 1979, 4 young boys had been murdered. Their ages ranged from 9 to 14. Each vanished while doing something ordinary: walking to a friend's house, riding a bike, running to the store. Parents warned their children to come straight home from school. Playgrounds sat empty. Streets grew quiet after dark. Yet despite the mounting deaths, city officials were hesitant to acknowledge a pattern. Police often listed children as runaways, and newspapers carried the same language. But Black parents knew better. They were losing their sons, and soon, their daughters. And they knew it was only the beginning. Atlanta entered 1980 gripping fear. 4 children were already dead, and the city still had no answers. By spring, the pattern would only grow clearer. As more children vanished, families organized their own patrols, and the community's cries grew louder. Atlanta could no longer look away. By 1980, the Atlanta child murders had moved beyond tragedy into a terrifying pattern. Parents knew something dark was happening. Children were vanishing while doing everyday things: watching TV with friends, running errands, heading to the pool, and one by one, their bodies were found discarded in the woods, empty lots, or rivers. For Atlanta's Black community, the question was no longer if there was a serial killer, but why wasn't anyone listening? On March 4th, 1980, 12-year-old Angel Lenair disappeared after leaving home to watch television at a friend's house. Angel was a sweet, quiet girl, known for her shy smile. Her family reported her missing almost immediately. They knew she wasn't a runaway. 6 days later, Angel's body was found in a wooden area. Her hands had been tied, and a pair of white underwear, not her own, was stuffed in her mouth. She had been strangled with a ligature. Angel's death marked a horrifying escalation in brutality. She was the first young girl linked to the series, and her murder shattered families who realized no child, boy or girl, was safe. Just 1 week later, another child was gone. On March 11, 1980, 11-year-old Jeffery Mathis left his home to run an errand for his mother. Witnesses later reported seeing him talking to a man in a car, but no single lead emerged. His mother begged for help, insisting Jeffery was not a runaway. But once again, authorities hesitated. It wasn't until months later that Jeffrey's remains were found in a remote area. When investigators examined the evidence, they found something unusual: Caucasian hairs, dog hairs, and unidentified fabric on his clothing. To some, this suggested the possibility of multiple perpetrators. Even decades later, Jeffrey's case remains one of the most contested in the series. On May 18, 1980, 14-year-old Eric Middlebrooks went missing. He had borrowed a neighbor's bike to visit a friend, but never made it home. Hours later, Eric's body was found next to that bicycle, abandoned in a parking lot beside a bar. He had been beaten with a blunt object and strangled. Eric's murder sent shockwaves across the city. His mother described him as a responsible boy who never gave her trouble. His death showed parents that their fears were real. Their children could vanish in the space of an evening. On June 9, 1980, 10-year-old Christopher Richardson disappeared on his way to the local swimming pool. His family reported him missing that same day. Months later, his body was found in a wooden area alongside other victims. His disappearance in broad daylight underscored the brazen nature of the killings. No time of day was safe anymore. By the summer of 1980, Atlanta was living in fear. Neighborhoods grew quiet. Families kept their children indoors. Churches organized watch groups, and parents walked their kids to school in groups like escorts. Parents called press conferences demanding action, and by autumn, a grassroots movement was underway to force city leaders to pay attention. But the police continued to downplay the pattern. Case after case was labeled a runaway, despite families' protests. The dismissive language stung. Parents were fighting not only for their children's safety, but for their dignity as victims. To them, it felt like their children's lives mattered less than others in the city. By the end of 1980, at least 8 children had been murdered or disappeared. The killings were no longer isolated. They were a crisis. Parents patrolled the streets by themselves. Church leaders held vigils, and marches began to draw local media attention. But it would take even more tragedy and more loss before the city fully admitted the truth. Atlanta had a serial killer, and the Black children of its neighborhoods were his targets. By late 1980, Atlanta was a city living in terror. At least 8 children were gone, their bodies turning up in woods, parking lots, and rivers. Black parents pleaded with authorities to take the cases seriously, but time and again, they were told their children had run away. The dismissals cut deep. These weren't runaways. These were sons and daughters who never came home. Parents described living in a constant state of anxiety. Mothers began waiting at bus stops long before the school bell rang. Fathers escorted children to the corner store, even for the smallest errands. Families locked their doors at night and refused to let their children play outside. Teachers noticed classrooms half empty, as some parents simply stopped sending their kids to school. It was as if childhood itself had been stolen from Atlanta's Black neighborhoods. The laughter of children on playgrounds was replaced by silence. The sound of jump ropes and basketballs gave way to curfews and caution. With law enforcement slow to act, the community stepped in. Parents and neighborhoods formed patrols. Driving through streets at night with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and car headlights sweeping alleys and woods. Churches opened their doors after dark so children had supervised spaces. Local leaders began hosting town halls where grieving families compared notes, piecing together what investigators should have been doing. The sense of abandonment by police was so deep that some families trusted neighbors more than detectives. Protecting the children became a community responsibility. Perhaps no figure embodied this grassroots fight more than Camille Bell, the mother of 9-year-old Yusuf. After losing her son, she refused to stay silent. Bell co-founded the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. Through marches, press conferences, and constant media pressure, she forced city officials to acknowledge what Black families had known for months. Atlanta had a serial killer. The committee distributed flyers, organized candlelight vigils, and raised money to support families of victims. They became lifelines in the midst of grief. Camille Bell and other parents turned private mourning into public action, a movement that the city could no longer ignore. By November 1980, the pressure had reached City Hall. Parents and activists rallied, demanding answers. They accused police of indifference, and many pointed to racism as the reason Black children's disappearances had been brushed aside. Mayor Maynard Jackson, Atlanta's first Black mayor, faced intense criticism. Under his leadership, the city had promised progress. But with Black families burying their children, progress felt hollow. Jackson walked a tightrope, trying to show empathy while also defending a police department that had failed the community. It was clear that without a major shift, the city's fragile trust was gone. The media's role in this crisis was complicated. Early on, newspapers and television downplayed the cases, often labeling victims as delinquents or runaways. This language hurt families and fueled the belief that Black children weren't valued. It wasn't until activists forced the issue, staging marches, flooding press conferences, and drawing national attention, that the media began to cover the story seriously. Even then, coverage was often sensational, focusing on fear rather than the children themselves. Families wanted their sons and daughters remembered as individuals, not just victims in a headline count. By the close of 1980, Atlanta's Black community was no longer begging. They were demanding. Parents marched with signs. Children carried placards with the names of their missing friends. Vigils filled with prayers and gospel songs spilled into city streets. The message was clear. Black children's lives mattered, and the city would be held accountable for protecting them. At last, the outcry forced action. In early 1981, a special task force was created. The FBI joined the case. Roadblocks, surveillance, and forensic testing would reshape the investigation. But as new resources poured in, so did new bodies. The city was about to enter its most dangerous year yet. By January 1981, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Nearly a dozen children were dead. Community protests had reached City Hall, and national media outlets were beginning to ask how the so-called city too busy to hate could be so slow to protect its Black children. Under mounting pressure, Atlanta police formed a special task force, and the FBI stepped in to assist. For the first time, the city's full resources were trained on the murders. But even as the investigation expanded, the killing continued. On January 3, 1981, 14-year-old Luby Jeter disappeared while running an errand near a shopping mall. His family described him as a bright and cheerful boy who dreamed of being an engineer. For a month, his family searched and prayed. Then, on February 5th, his body was discovered. The cause of death was asphyxiation. When investigators analyzed his clothing, they found fibers that would later be matched to Wayne Williams' home and car. Luby's death marked the beginning of a year that would claim more young lives than any before. Only weeks later, January 22nd, 15-year-old Terry Pugh went missing. He lived in the same apartment complex as an earlier victim. A chilling overlap investigators could no longer ignore. Days later, police received an anonymous phone call telling them exactly where to find Terry's body. When they arrived, they discovered he had been strangled. The caller was never identified. Was it the killer toying with the police, or someone in the community who knew more than they let on? To this day, no one knows. On February 6, 12-year-old Patrick Baltazar went missing. His body was found days later, strangled. Investigators noted something crucial: fibers and dog hairs on Patrick's clothing. Later testing suggested a mitochondrial DNA match to Williams's German Shepherd. At the time, this was groundbreaking forensic evidence. Though decades later, experts would caution that the science was not as precise as it was presented in court. By the spring of 1981, a grim new pattern emerged. Bodies were being pulled from the Chattahoochee River. Investigators believed the killer was dumping victims from bridges under cover of night. In response, they launched one of the most ambitious surveillance operations Atlanta had ever seen. Police and FBI agents camped out along bridges, waiting for the killer to return to his dumping grounds. It was a desperate strategy. Officers listening in the dark, straining to hear the splash of a body hitting the water. Dozens of detectives sat in unmarked cars, watching, waiting, hoping to catch someone in the act. Even as the investigation ramped up, families continued to bury their children. The death toll climbed past 20. Parents were furious. Activists accused officials of moving too slowly because the victims were Black. National media descended on Atlanta, portraying the city as gripped by terror. Mayor Maynard Jackson and the police chief gave regular press conferences, but their reassurances ran hollow for families still waiting for justice. The FBI introduced behavioral profiling, suggesting the killer might be a Black man who lived in the community, someone who could move unnoticed without drawing suspicion. This theory unsettled many, as it shifted attention away from white supremacist groups that some believed were behind the killings. By May 1980, the task force had staked out bridges across the city. In the early hours of May 22nd, 2 officers heard a loud splash in the Chattahoochee River. Moments later, they stopped a car leaving the bridge. Behind the wheel was 23-year-old Wayne Williams, an aspiring music promoter. He claimed he was out auditioning a singer named Cheryl Johnson, but no Cheryl Johnson ever existed. 2 days later, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Carter was pulled from the river downstream. Investigators believe Carter was the splash the officers heard that night. This chance encounter would change the trajectory of the investigation and Atlanta's history forever. With Wayne Williams now at the center of suspicion, investigators combed through his home, his car, and his life. They believed they had found their man, but the community was divided. Could this young music promoter really be responsible for so many deaths? Or was he being used as a convenient scapegoat to calm a city on edge? On the night of May 22, 1981, Atlanta's child murder investigation reached a turning point. For weeks, police and FBI agents had been stationed along the city's bridges, waiting in the dark for the killer to strike again. At around 3 a.m., officers near the James Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a loud splash in the Chattahoochee River. Within minutes, they stopped the only car driving away from the scene, a station wagon. Behind the wheel was a young man named Wayne Bertram Williams. What followed would change the course of the investigation forever. Wayne Williams was born May 27, 1958, in Atlanta, Georgia. The son of 2 school teachers, he grew up in a stable, middle-class household. Bright and curious, Wayne excelled in electronics and communications. As a teenager, he built his own radio station in his parents' basement, wiring transmitters and broadcasting music to neighbors. Teachers and classmates remembered him as ambitious, even precocious, someone who believed he was destined for bigger things. Wayne dreamed of making it in the music industry. He called himself a producer and a talent scout, driving around Atlanta with demo tapes, promising young singers and groups that he could make them stars. He spent time at local radio stations where DJs remembered him as eager to break into the business. But behind the confidence was a young man struggling to turn ambition into reality. Those who knew Williams described him in conflicting ways. Some called him intelligent, charming, and driven. Others said he could be manipulative, with a quick temper, and needed to be in control. He often surrounded himself with teenagers, recruiting them for music projects. Some parents grew suspicious of his intentions, wondering why a 23-year-old man spent so much time with young boys. Investigators would later seize on this pattern as part of their case. The morning of May 22, 1981, brought Williams face to face with law enforcement. After hearing the splash in the river, police flagged down his car. He told officers he was headed to audition a young singer named Cheryl Johnson in the suburb of Smyrna. But when police tried to follow up, they found no Cheryl Johnson, no phone number, no address, no person by that name. The alibi collapsed instantly. 2 days later, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater surfaced downstream. Witnesses later testified they had seen Williams and Cater together the night before Cater's disappearance. To investigators, this was no coincidence. It was the break they had been waiting for. When police searched Williams' car and home, they uncovered what they believed was damning evidence. Fibers from carpets, bedspreads, and clothing were microscopically consistent with fibers found on multiple victims. Dog hairs from his German Shepherd also matched those recovered on bodies. Though fiber analysis was a young science, prosecutors would later argue that the statistical odds of so many matches by chance were nearly impossible. Investigators also found gloves and a length of nylon cord in his car, items consistent with strangulation, the cause of death in many of the murders. Williams underwent 3 polygraph tests. Each one came back inconclusive. But in the eyes of detectives, the case was solidifying. When Wayne Williams' name hit the press, Atlanta erupted. Some community members felt relief, believing the nightmare was finally over. Others were deeply skeptical. Could one young music promoter really have murdered so many children and teens? Or was Williams being framed to ease public outrage and restore the city's reputation? The murder stopped after his arrest, a fact many took as proof of his guilt. But to others, the timing was too convenient. From the start, Williams' arrest divided Atlanta almost as sharply as the killings themselves. By January 1982, Wayne Williams was on trial. But not for the murders of children. He was charged with killing 2 young men, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. Prosecutors argued that proving those cases would also prove his responsibility for nearly 24 others. The trial would become one of the most watched in Atlanta's history, and one of the most controversial. On January 6, 1982, Wayne Williams walked into a Fulton County courtroom accused of murder. Despite being called the Atlanta child murderer, he wasn't on trial for the deaths of the children. Instead, prosecutors charged him with the murders of 2 adults, 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne and 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, both found in the Chattahoochee River in the spring of 1981. But for Atlanta, this trial represented more than 2 lives. It became a referendum on the murder of nearly 30 children. The state's case rested on fibers, tiny strands of carpet, bedding, and dog hair. Experts testified that these fibers were consistent with those found in Williams' home, car, and on his German Shepherd. 19 different sources of fibers were presented, linking Williams to multiple victims. Prosecutors told the jury that the odds of so many fiber matches being coincidence were astronomical. Witnesses also placed Williams with Cater the night before his disappearance. Others testified that Williams often approached young boys, offering them money, jobs, or music opportunities. Together, prosecutors argued, these details painted Williams as a predator hiding behind charm and ambition. Williams' defense team pushed back hard. They argued that fiber analysis was junk science, unproven, unreliable, and too easily manipulated. They reminded the jury that fibers were common. Anyone in Atlanta could have similar carpets or clothing. They also highlighted the lack of direct evidence. No eyewitnesses saw Williams commit a murder. No fingerprints or blood tied him to the crime scenes. Williams himself took the stand, a risky move. He insisted on his innocence and claimed the police were desperate to pin the murders on him. At times combative, at times emotional, Williams' testimony divided the courtroom. Some saw a man wrongly accused. Others saw arrogance and defiance. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the trial was the use of pattern evidence. Though Williams was only charged with 2 murders, the judge allowed prosecutors to introduce testimony about 10 additional cases, mostly children. Families sat in court as their loved ones' names were read, their deaths described, even though Williams wasn't formally charged with them. The prosecution argued this showed a consistent pattern of behavior. The defense called it character assassination. For the jury, it blurred the lines between what was proven and what was suggested. They were being asked not only to judge the murders of 2 men, but to shoulder the weight of nearly 24 unsolved deaths. On February 27, 1982, after nearly 2 months of testimony and just 11 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on both counts of murder. Wayne Williams was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Prosecutors declared victory, announcing that 22 additional cases would officially be closed, even though Williams had never been tried for them. For officials, the case was over, but for many families, it was just another wound. They had lost their children, and now they had lost a chance to ever see their cases fully investigated in court. The trial's outcome was hailed as justice, but it left a trail of controversy. Critics argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. In later years, the Department of Justice itself criticized fiber and hair evidence as being overstated in trials across the country. Some families never accepted the verdict. They believe Williams was guilty of some murders, but not all. Others insisted he was innocent entirely, a scapegoat chosen to calm a frightened city. Allegations of Ku Klux Klan involvement resurfaced, fueled by FBI files showing that white supremacists had been investigated but never charged. The murders did stop after Williams' arrest, a fact prosecutors pointed to as proof of his guilt. But skeptics argued the increased police presence and national attention may have deterred other perpetrators. In Atlanta, the debate never ended. Was Wayne Williams the Atlanta child murderer, or was he simply the man the city needed him to be? Williams' conviction closed the courtroom chapter, but the legacy of the Atlanta child murderers was far from resolved. For decades, families have fought to reopen cases, to re-examine evidence, and to tell the stories of children who were never truly given justice. The case remains one of America's most haunting mysteries. Wayne Williams was convicted in 1982. But for all Atlanta families, the story didn't end in the courtroom. The conviction raised as many questions as it answered. Some parents believed justice had been served. Others felt silenced. Their children's cases closed without ever seeing a trial. More than 40 years later, the Atlanta child murders remain unsolved, a scar in the city's history and a symbol of how justice can fail the most vulnerable. Wayne Williams remains in prison, still proclaiming his innocence. Families remain divided, still mourning without closure. And the truth of who killed Atlanta's children remains uncertain. More than 40 years later, the question still hangs heavy. Who really murdered Atlanta's children? Between 1979 and 1981, at least 29 children, teens, and adults were murdered in Atlanta. Nearly all of them Black. Most were from working-class neighborhoods, and most of their cases remain unsolved. Wayne Williams sits in prison today, convicted of 2 adult murders, still claiming his innocence. Authorities closed nearly 24 other cases after his conviction, but many families never saw justice. Their children's names were placed in files marked cleared, but the stories were never fully told in court. Edward Hope Smith, Alfred Evans, Milton Harvey, Yusuf Bell, Angel Lenair, Jeffery Mathis, Eric Middlebrooks, Christopher Richardson, Latanya Wilson, Aaron Wyke, Patrick Rogers, Darren Glass, still missing to this day, Charles Stevens, Joseph Bell, William Barrett, Curtis Walker, Luby Jeter, Terry Pugh, Patrick Baltazar, Larry Rogers, John Porter, Timothy Hill, Clifford Jones, Michael McIntosh, Earl Terrell, Eddie Duncan, Jimmy Ray Payne, Nathaniel Cater. These are the names we know, but there may be others, children and young people whose deaths weren't officially tied to the case, or whose families are still waiting in silence. Every one of them mattered. Every one of them deserved protection. This has been the Ebony Cases from the Icy Bridge Files. Thank you for remembering with me. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never forget, every story deserves to be told.